Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, two issues have been figuratively burned into our national and local psyche these last 2 years: jobs and education. We have heard seemingly every conceivable argument for and against both, but now with the national elections behind us, what do educators and educator functionaries say? Welcome once again to the longest running and the most widely watched source for Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and on this Executive Profile special, South Carolina State Superintendent of Education, Dr. Mick Zais.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded October 26, 2012. On this week's program, an executive profile featuring Dr. Mick Zais, State Superintendent of Education, South Carolina. Now, Chris William.
Hello, welcome again to our program. Dr. Zais, glad you're here. Thank you for taking time.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure being with you.
Thank you. Gosh, there's so many things to talk about, Mick. With K through 12 education, as you well know, and I'm not telling you anything, but it's so polarizing. People are so passionate. Parents are so involved. Teachers are so involved. You know, we hear so many things about education. I think of it almost as a bit of a proxy for the healthcare industry, and that is there's so many working parts and there's seemingly so many dysfunctional parts. Does the system need to be completely rebooted? Are we going down the wrong path?
I think you're right, Chris. I haven't used the term rebooted. What I've used is transformed. Not reformed, but transformed. And that means that there's so many things that we need to do differently in education. I've consistently said the biggest problem in education is not a shortage of money. It's a shortage of accountability, competition, and incentives. Three aspects that are prominent in American culture, but which are sorely lacking in our education establishments.
So, well, let's break that down. Let's talk about the folks on the ground
Sure.
with the kids. Let's talk about the teachers.
Okay.
Are they compensated the right way?
Well, no, absolutely not. I've consistently said we don't pay our best teachers nearly enough.
Is that the best in the good schools or the best in the bad schools?
The best across the board, and we know how to figure that out, and I can talk about that. And we pay our least effective teachers far too much. You know, Chris, the teacher in the top 20% will impart on average a year and a half's learning in one academic year. Teacher in the bottom 20%, 6 months of learning. That's a 1-year difference between the top 20% and the bottom 20%, or a 300% difference. Yet we pay them all the same. Nationwide, we have a crisis in education. Far too many kids are dropping out of high school, disengaged, disinterested. Reading is a huge issue across the nation. In some of our schools, up to 35% of our 9th graders are reading at the 4th grade level or lower. The issue isn't that they're not smart enough, they just never learned to read. And then the problem is, one of the problems, is we know that while every child is special, every child is different. They differ in ability, motivation, the rates at which they mature, their interests, their skill set, their personality, their home environment. But our traditional school model puts every child in the same classroom, expects them to learn the same material in the same way on the same schedule. The thing that surprises me is that actually works for most students, but for far too many it produces frustration and failure. And frankly, it's unfair to the teacher who is expected to be all things to all students simultaneously.
So let's start to break that down a little bit. So you've got, I think you articulated that pretty well. So how do you raise teacher salaries? How do you not just incentivize the teachers, but how do you make sure that the performance, that the kids coming out of that whatever that grade is, or finishing high school, how do you tie that teacher's pay to that performance or the growth of that child?
Okay, let me start with an example and then talk about the principal. I was in a middle school recently in Orangeburg County in South Carolina, and the principal said, you know, Dr. Zais, the first year I was just figuring out who's who and what's what. But at the beginning of the second year, I told my teachers, I don't expect miracles, but I do expect a child to learn a year's worth of material in a year's time. So if a child enters your classroom 18 months behind, they shouldn't leave your classroom at the end of the year 2 years behind. I said, how'd that work out? She said, well, at the end of that second year, I put 13 teachers on an improvement plan. An improvement plan is the first step in the formal separation process. I said, well, how'd that work? She said, well, I'm not sure. That summer, they all transferred to different school districts. I said, oh, don't tell me that. She said, that's not the worst part, Dr. Zais. I didn't receive one phone call from a principal, a superintendent, an HR director, or anybody asking me about these teachers. Right now, we don't have a system in place in South Carolina or in most states across the nation to differentiate how much children are learning in a teacher's classroom. But nationwide, there is a movement to evaluate teachers and principals on student growth, not on achievement scores. That's the summation of everything that you've done to that point in your education, but on how much did that child learn in your classroom. And that would be comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges based on what were their characteristics and test scores entering your classroom. Look at everybody who was identical to that child in background and test scores, and see what the expectation is and compare the teacher against the expectation.
So if it's that black and white, you know, simple things are never easy or rarely easy. So if it's that simple, then why can't more people see that? Why can't the system be tweaked a little bit? Is this just about status quo, about changing the old ways?
Well, you know, this is not a partisan policy agenda about holding teachers and principals accountable. This is the only area I know where literally Al Sharpton and Newt Gingrich are appearing around the country arm in arm to advocate on these kinds of reforms that hold teachers, principals, school boards accountable for the success of their children. A lot of people want to blame it on poverty, and certainly poverty is a factor, but it's not an excuse. And we know that because in South Carolina, some of our best performing schools are high poverty.
Then where is it? What's the challenge?
Well, the challenge is some of our highest poverty schools are also low performing. And people tell me, well, Mick, you know, before we can fix education, we got to fix poverty. No, it works the other way around. Before you fix poverty, you got to fix education. But the difference between high poverty schools that are failing and those that are knocking it out of the ballpark is not the demographics of the students, and it's not the education level of the parents. It's the competence of the adults in the system. And it starts with the school board, by the way. A poor school board can ruin a whole school district. Mm-hmm. But if you've got great teachers, principals, superintendents, and a school board, you're going to have high achieving schools. And we see that some of our top performing districts in South Carolina, some of our poorest.
I think of Dr. Rainey Knight, who was Superintendent of the Year in South Carolina last year or this year. In Darlington County, certainly high unemployment.
Darlington County has 82% students on free and reduced lunch, one of our highest poverty counties, and it's the 5th highest ranked district in the state out of 86 districts. I mean, I'm a big fan of Rainey Knight. She is one of my heroes because she's proven that poor kids can learn and poverty is not an excuse.
So, you know, again, you talked about principals, Dr. Zais. This is the principal. I would guess the principal is an underappreciated position, and clearly got to be one of the linchpins, got to be one of the strong linchpins in the system. Are they compensated well? Are they appreciated? Do they get enough latitude to run their school?
No, on all three counts. We know that, again, going back to the research, a principal in the top 20% will elevate test scores throughout the school 15 percentile points, or in the bottom 20% decrease. You know, the difference between being in the 50th percentile and the 80th percentile is the difference between not going to college and going to college and graduating. And that's just to the principal. You know, they call principals administrators. They're not. They're leaders. And the number one job of the principal, who is a leader, is to recruit, develop, motivate, and retain excellent teachers. There's not a great school anywhere in the country that doesn't have a dynamic principal who has excellent teachers in the classroom. But there are plenty of schools with reams of curriculum standards and shelves of standardized tests that doesn't make a hill of beans difference if you don't have great teachers.
How do you break down the barriers for these principals and let them run with the ball? How do you do that?
Well, one of the things that I've been a strong advocate for is far more flexibility. Chris, we got too many rules and policies coming out of Washington, and frankly, we got too many coming out of Raleigh and Columbia, South Carolina. But a policy that makes sense in an affluent suburban school may make no sense in a poor rural school, and vice versa. I'm trying to remove those bureaucratic handcuffs that limit the authority of principals and superintendents, not only over curriculum, but over discipline and standards and other things. Now, accountability and autonomy are two sides of the same coin. Let me illustrate with a trivial example that your listeners will relate to. Steve Spurrier can't be held accountable for the one-loss record of those Gamecocks if the athletic director is selecting the assistant coaches and the admissions department is recruiting the student athletes.
You're trying to start a debate here, aren't you?
No, but that's what we do in our schools. Yeah. You know, we tell the superintendent, you're in charge, but oh, by the way, here's your principals and here's your teachers. Do the best you can with what you got.
Okay, all right, Dr. Zais, this opens up a whole lot of stuff. So with you with this reform-minded kind of push here, how do you, when you do, I'm not going to say run afoul, but when you are counter to the governor or when you are counter to the State House, how do you maintain some respectful policy oppositional dialogue without it turning nasty, without it boiling out into the press and becoming something that it never intended to be? I mean, how do you stand across from how do you not have the same opinion and try to get some of these reforms done?
Who said it wasn't nasty? Of course it's nasty. Anything in politics is nasty. I was told, you know, when I decided to run for office after spending 10 years as a college president and 31 years as an infantry soldier, people said, Mick, it's a full contact sport and it can get really dirty. And there's a lot of people who are unencumbered by scruples. And so, I mean, I read things in the newspaper, they're absolute nonsense, but that, you know, and you see that in politics, you've seen that all the time. So what I've kind of concluded is that most people in our state General Assembly, our representatives and senators, are not going to be on the lead on this reform. They're going to follow what their voters are asking for. And so that my lever is public opinion, which is why appearances on shows such as yours are so important. So I can tell people, you know, we've got to change the system. United States used to be first in the world in high school graduation rate. Now we're 18 out of 24 industrialized nations. The United States has the shortest school day and the shortest school year of any industrialized nation. Countries that have invested in high-paid teachers with long school days and long school years pay for that by having larger classes. Countries like Luxembourg and Belgium, which value small classes, have poorly paid teachers, but smaller numbers of students in them.
And what are the outcome of those kids coming out of this?
Well, what we've said before and again, the most important variable in the child's education is the effectiveness of that man or woman standing at the front of the classroom. And we should invest in effective and high-quality teachers. Not highly qualified. that's certificates and degrees. And you know what? Those don't matter for a hill of beans. All the research shows that bachelor's prepared teachers are just as effective as those with masters and doctorates. And after 5 years in the classroom, teachers don't get any better. You are who you are.
You know, a lot is put on teachers, and I know you know this, sir, but a lot is put on teachers. When you, in the military as you were, you know the important connection of a family's on the morale of a soldier. So when you've got students in the system and their parents are not engaged, how do you compel parents to be better parents?
Well, you can't compel them, but what the really great principals are doing is they have a systematic program of outreach. I was in a small rural school that, again, was knocking it out of the ballpark recently, and I asked him about parental involvement. He said, actually, it's pretty good. I said, well, how do you do that? He said, well, 2 weeks before school starts, every teacher calls every student's parent. He said, some of these parents don't have cars or televisions, but they all have got a cell phone. And say, you know, I'm Mick Zais, I'm your child's 5th grade teacher. I'm really looking forward to meeting Jason. I love these children. I'm a teacher because I believe in our future. And I'm so excited about the beginning of the year. If there's any problems, here's my phone number. He said 2 weeks after school starts, every teacher calls every parent and says, I've really enjoyed getting to know Jason. He's a fine young man, has trouble sitting still in his chair sometimes, but we'll work with that. And again, looking forward to seeing you, and here's my number. And then, you know, a week before the parent-teacher conference, call them again. And you got to make them feel comfortable. A lot of these poor parents, you know, for them, school was a place of humiliation and frustration.
Sure.
They didn't like their teachers. And so, but it's incumbent on the teachers and the administration to reach out to these parents and make them feel comfortable in the school environment, make them feel respected and welcome.
Teacher pay. You had mentioned this before. Do they need to be paid better? Should tenure not be the issue that it is now? And do teachers need a more consistent, should teachers and should classes be in session longer?
All of the above. Actually, I would, again, across the board, I think our best teachers should be paid more. And that our least effective teachers shouldn't be in the classroom. And you know, it's not because these teachers don't care or aren't hardworking. I was reading a study recently said our best teachers work on average 50 hours a week. Mm-hmm. It's a hard job. Our least effective teachers work on average 50 hours a week. They're not effective not because they don't care or love the kids or aren't dedicated or aren't loyal to the administration. They just don't have the gift. Teaching is a talent and a gift, and it's hard work, and some are good at it and some aren't. Now, you can get a little bit better by development and going to training sessions, but after a while, you are who you are. It's like music or athletics. You know, I tried to be a good athlete in high school, and I practiced just as hard as some of these great stars. But you know, I reached my level and it wasn't good enough. Then I tried to be a musician, and I practiced really hard. But you know what, Chris? I just didn't have the talent. And when it came time to select members of the band or the glee club, I didn't make the cut. So what I tell our principals and superintendents, with compassion and dignity and respect, we need to help these teachers who just aren't helping kids learn find a new profession. And we need to heap honor and respect and appropriate compensation on our greatest teachers.
So do you think that's a big part of it here, Mick? Do you think there's a lack of respect going? I mean, we've certainly seen it in the political debate, but I mean, do we retreat to our sides and make our case and don't try to reach out to the, I mean, I hate to be that ethereal about this.
A recent Gallup poll, and they've been keeping track since 1973, in the confidence in American institutions and public education, they started asking the question. In the 2011 poll, Americans' confidence in public education is at the lowest in the history as it's ever been.
Primary?
K through 12.
Yeah, okay.
And we've got a crisis here in our country. Another problem is, Chris, is I told you about this one-size-fits-all.
Yeah.
You know, and kids learn at different rates, but they all, under current system, have to learn at the same rate. I think every child should be challenged to the limit of her or his ability, And if we've got the same standard for every child at the same rate, some kids aren't going to make that. But, you know, if they're doing the best they can, if the teachers are doing the best they can, let's honor that. Single gender schools work great for some kids. Montessori is a great option for some kids. It wouldn't have worked for me because I couldn't work independently at that age. We've got a military magnet school in Charleston that's knocking it out of the ballpark. Arts-infused programs really work for some kids. Science and technology-focused schools are a great option. For other kids who have developmental difficulties or social problems, homeschool or online virtual schools are a good option. But far too many of our kids are stuck in failing schools with no options. Chris, high-income people have school choice. Middle-income families have school choice. They move to the suburbs where they've got schools that are zoned high quality. It's only our low-income families that are stuck in parentally failing schools with no option. We've got to provide options for those low-income families in failing schools.
You know, and you also made mention, and we're ticking through a lot of things, Dr. Zais, because we're going to run out of time, but you also made mention about the leadership, the volunteer leadership, the parental leadership, and especially school boards. We all roll our eyes when we read these stories about school boards that are dysfunctional, and that's being kind to say in some ways. Is there a different way that we need to have that board, that authority leadership model for a school system?
I think the business community, and at least in my state, South Carolina, by and large has opted out of the school systems. You don't see bankers, doctors, lawyers, businessmen running for school board. They just
Why?
Don't. Well, they don't. Well, they say, well, I don't know anything about education. You don't have to know anything about education. I mean, if you've had children, you know about as much as you need to know. And you know that while every child is special, every child is different. And one size doesn't fit all. And you understand as a business person or as a person who's experienced in the community that not all teachers are effective, just like not all lawyers are any good. Not all doctors are great doctors. And we have, you know, people say, Mick, education is not like business. And I go, well, you know, education is a service delivery challenge. And just like law and medicine, where every legal client and every medical patient's different, so too every student's different.
So, and you've been through the process, running for state superintendent of education, getting there, going through the, you know, the hard-knuckle, bloody battle, you know, bare-knuckle swings of politics. How do you spin that to someone that just doesn't want to stick their head up out of the foxhole and get it shot off?
Well, I just came from, before I came here, I was speaking to a group and I said, you know, if you want to make a difference, here's a couple things you can do. First of all, you can participate in your local school board meeting. Ask them how they're spending their money. How much are they spending on administration? I was at a district recently. They paid their district administrators, on average, $20,000 a year more than they paid their principals. Go figure. You know, I've been a staff officer and I've been a leader, and I can assure you that being a leader, like a principal, is 10 times harder than being a staff officer. It's the principals who are getting phone calls at 4 o'clock in the morning because of snow, or at 6 o'clock in the morning because the bus broke down, or getting irate phone calls from parents. Being a principal is a hard job. It's a leadership job. Those, you know, deputy superintendent for curriculum design or deputy superintendent for teacher effectiveness, you ought to be paying your best people to be principals, not staff folks. But
we have about 30 seconds left. Does the General Assembly, or does the State House get it? Does the leadership understand the funding, how important the funding of the education and to be engaged? Do they get it?
The General Assembly responds far too much to the lobby groups, the teachers' lobby groups, the school administrator lobby groups, the school board lobby groups. They spend more money than any other industry in the nation, more than Teamsters, more than the legal, more than the medical, and they are very, very powerful, and they are dead set on maintaining the status quo.
Would you come back and keep this conversation going?
I'd be happy to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zais. Nice to see you. If you'd like to follow this conversation, you can on Twitter, @CarolinaPolicy, or go to CarolinaBusinessReview.com. Watch the program, watch past programs. Thank you for watching. I hope your weekend is good. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.